Christmas Eve, 1945. Everything was merry and bright in the town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Twinkling lights illuminated the town. Families and children anticipating the coming days of cheerful Christmas get-togethers. But after a series of bizarre events, at 1 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the Sodder family were met with tragedy. Their home unexpectedly and mysteriously went up in flames. Some of the family escaped, but 5 of their children were never seen again. Officials ruled they must have perished in the fire, but others, including the Sodder family, believed that the fire was set deliberately, and their 5 children were kidnapped that Christmas Eve. The circumstances leading up to the fire and what came afterwards have left the public questioning what really happened that night. It's one of the most puzzling Christmastime mysteries of all time. This is Avery After Dark, and I'm your host, Avery Ross. Welcome back to the show. I'm so glad you tuned in for today's episode. Many of you have requested this case, and you know how I roll. You ask, and I give it to you. When I first looked into the Sodder family case, I read a super brief summary of the story a few months back. Wanted to see what the case was all about. And I initially wondered, where's the mystery here? It seemed pretty open and shut. A tragic fire, but this past week, I decided to look into it a bit more, and oh my goodness, was I mistaken? This is anything but open and shut. This will be one of the most complex cases we cover on Avery After Dark. It is twist after twist. And be warned, this story is a never-ending rabbit hole. Beforehand, thanks so much for subscribing to this channel. Leave a like and a comment while you're here and turn on post notifications. I upload new videos every week and I never want you missing out. And if you're new here, welcome. On Avery After Dark, I cover true crime, mysteries, supernatural, and everything in between. So if that's up your alley, you're in the right place. Now let's get right into it, shall we? Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George and Jenny Sodder, along with their 9 children, had spent the night at home as usual, looking forward to the days ahead. George Sodder had immigrated to the United States from Italy. Fayetteville had a large Italian community, and George Sodder became very well known in town. He and his family lived in a 2-story house 2 miles north of town. The Sodders were regarded as one of the most respected families around per a local official. George was a businessman and had his own trucking company. He was also very vocal about his stances and wasn't afraid to share his opinions, specifically about his opposition to Mussolini, the Italian prime minister and dictator. And George's stances led to some heated arguments with members in the Italian community in Fayetteville. But all in all, they settled in well there. The Sodders and their kids lived a nice life. That was until that night. That evening, the family had been celebrating and spending time together. The Sodders' oldest daughter, Marion, worked at a store in downtown Fayetteville and surprised 3 of her younger sisters with new toys she had brought home as gifts. The 3 younger girls were so excited and asked their mom, Jenny, if they could stay up past their bedtimes and play. Jenny said yes and went up to bed, telling the girls not to stay up too late. The Sodders' son, Maurice, and his younger brother, Louis, put the cows in and fed the chickens that night before going up to bed as well. George Sodder and the 2 oldest boys, John and George, were already asleep upstairs. Having worked that day for their father, they were all quite tired. And eventually, everyone turned in for the night. At 12:30 a.m., Jenny was lying in bed and heard the telephone ring. So she got up and went to answer it, noticing that all the lights were still on downstairs and the curtains weren't drawn as they normally would be. Usually the Sodder children would attend to these things when they stayed up later than their parents. Jenny looked over and saw that Marion had fallen asleep on the living room couch. She walked over, answered the phone, and on the other end of the line was a woman whose voice she didn't recognize, asking for someone she didn't know. In the background of the call, Jenny heard glasses clinking and laughter. She told the woman that she had the wrong number. The woman then let out a very strange laugh. So Jenny hangs up the phone, turns off the lights, and goes back to bed. Then at 1 a.m., just 30 minutes later, Jenny was again awakened to the sound of a noise on the roof above her. A loud bang, and then a rolling noise, as if someone had dropped or thrown something. She sat up, waited, but didn't hear anything else, so she went back to sleep. 30 minutes later, Jenny woke up again and smelled smoke as it poured into her room. To her shock, their house was on fire. Jenny frantically woke George up. They saw the room that George used as an office was on fire. George, Ginny, and 4 of their children were able to escape. The children that got out of the burning house were 2-year-old Sylvia, 17-year-old Marion, 23-year-old John, and 16-year-old George Jr. But that left 5 children missing, still in the house. The ones still inside were 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louis, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty. The 5 of them shared 2 bedrooms between them, and both of these bedrooms were upstairs. As they were running out, the family screamed for the children upstairs, but heard no response from any of them. It was silent up there. George then decided to run back into the home to try to save them, but he found that the staircase leading upstairs was on fire. So George runs to grab his ladder that he always kept in a certain spot outside the house, but he gets there to find that it isn't in its usual spot, and it wasn't anywhere nearby either. He thought quickly. George had 2 trucks he used for work that were parked out in front of the house. He thought he could maybe use them to climb on top and get into the children's bedrooms, so he ran over, jumped in, but strangely found that neither of the trucks would start, even though they had been working perfectly just the previous day. A water barrel that could have been used to extinguish the fire was frozen solid, so that was another dead end. With no way to save them, the Sodders were forced to stand there and watch their house burn down, collapsing over the next 45 minutes, believing the 5 children were inside. Now here's where things get even more insane. As George is frantically running around trying to find a way to save his children. In the meantime, Marianne quickly ran over to a neighbor's house to get help. She got there and they called the fire department, but the operator didn't respond. Then another neighbor called for help, and the operator didn't answer them either. The same neighbor jumped in his car and drove into town. The department was only 2.5 miles away from the Sodder house. This neighbor found the fire chief, a man named F.J. Morris, in person, and told him that the Sodder family house was on fire. They needed help urgently. But shockingly, the fire department didn't get to the Sodder house until 8 a.m., 7 hours after the fire started. They said this was because of low manpower due to the war, and the fire chief Morris said their response was also slow because he didn't know how to drive the fire truck, so he had to wait until someone who knew how to drive it was available. When they finally did get there, the house was nothing but ash. Officials searched for any remains in what was left of the Sodders' home, but nothing was found, and the children were presumed dead. In the following week, the coroner's office issued death certificates for the 5 children. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, stated that the fire was so hot that any remains would be completely cremated. But this isn't entirely true. Also strange, appliances were found in the ash, still recognizable, along with fragments from the tin roof, so not everything was destroyed. There was also a report that officials did find bone fragments in the fire, but chose not to tell the family. Officials ruled the cause of the fire was bad wiring. That, along with the fire department showing up 7 hours late, it was a disaster. Beneath the ash from the fire, the only thing that remained of the house was the basement. And in the following days, George couldn't bear the sight and covered up the basement with dirt to create a memorial for his children. So, a horrible fire, a tragic loss. Was that it? Not at all. In the weeks following, George and Ginny began to really question the fire. They had a strange feeling. They didn't believe that their children were dead, but rather had been kidnapped. And the fire was set as a diversion. One thing that stuck out to George was the fire chief blaming this on faulty wiring. George couldn't believe it, because he had just had the wiring checked by the power company just a few months prior that fall. This electrician deemed that the wiring of the home was in safe working order. And glaringly, George noted that the family's Christmas lights had remained on throughout the fire's early stages, when the power should have been out if it was faulty wiring. And even stranger, remember that ladder that was supposed to be leaning up against the house? It was later found in an embankment 75 feet away from the house. How it got there is a mystery. George also felt that his trucks not starting that night was incredibly suspicious. As I mentioned before, they had been running perfectly just hours before. And when George hears about Ginny's account of what happened the hour before the fire, he became incredibly concerned. She tells him about the strange phone call, the lights being on the hour before the fire started, and most importantly, the strange sounds on the roof, like someone had dropped something and it rolled, only 30 minutes before the fire erupted. In the following months, when the Sodder family was walking around the ash, they stumbled upon a strange object on the ground. George believed this is what Jenny heard drop and roll on the roof before the fire, and he believed it was a napalm pineapple bomb. All of these really strange and suspicious circumstances were starting to add up, and it didn't take long for theories to begin popping up about this fire not being so accidental. Conversations about George, his stances on Mussolini, enemies he could have possibly made because of these stances were discussed. And it should be said, George himself was a bit of a mystery. In his years in the United States, he never revealed why he left Italy. He always kept that very private. But some believed it was because he got involved in some shady business in Italy. But either way, many people wondered, was revenge, retaliation, the motive to kidnap George's children that night? Little did the family know, this was only the beginning. What came next shocked everyone. Go to part 2.